Okay, so we will get started. Welcome everybody to our Novel Justice book series event this month. My name is Jennifer Teitcher, and I am a postdoc here at the Wilson Center for Science and Justice. For those of you who might not be familiar with the center, the Wilson Center brings together faculty and students in a wide range of fields, such as law, medicine, public policy, and social sciences, to pursue research, policy and reform, and education to improve criminal justice outcomes. We also engage with state and local government and community stakeholders to translate our interdisciplinary work into effective and practical policy. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have Drs. Benjamin Van Rooij and Adam Fine here to talk to us about their recent book, The Behavioral Code: The Hidden Ways the Law Makes Us Better or Worse. Benjamin is a professor in law and society and the director of research at the School of Law at the University of Amsterdam, and he is joining us here from the Netherlands. He is also a global professor of law at the University of California, Irvine. His research on law and behavior was awarded a highly competitive and prestigious €2 million grant by the European Research Council, and his academic work has been featured in the New York Times, The Hill, NPR, and Huffington Post. Adam is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice and of law and behavioral sciences at Arizona State University. His award-winning work has been funded by the United States Department of Justice and a visionary grant from the American Psychological Foundation. His numerous, and I mean numerous, peer-reviewed publications have routinely appeared in the top journals in psychology and law, developmental psychology, public policy, criminology, and criminal justice. On a more personal note, as a UCI alum myself for graduate school, it's exciting to be having this UCI reunion over Zoom. Adam went to UCI, but also Adam was 2 years ahead of me in the same department in graduate school and someone I looked up to. So to have our paths cross professionally like this, beyond just attending the same conferences, is not only a real honor for me, but also a really fun opportunity. So welcome, Adam and Benjamin. It's really wonderful to have you here. I also want to encourage everyone, please feel free to ask questions. You can use the raising hand function. You can make your comments in the chat and we will look at it. And so however you would like to participate, please feel free to do so. We would love to hear from you. So to get started, Adam and Benjamin, you have taken on an incredibly tough topic: how to promote rule following and curb rule breaking from an interdisciplinary perspective. We have laws that are supposed to be put in place to keep us safe and to ensure order and procedural justice, but people have been breaking the law or breaking rules since the beginning of time, and unfortunately that's not really going away anytime soon. So what prompted you to tackle this this topic and prompted you to write this book, and who is your intended audience for this topic?
So I think if I can start this one, we have two stories here, and my story is I was trained in law and in Chinese language and cultures, and in 2000 I started to do research in China about environmental law, and I was a typical legal scholar. I just wanted to know the rules and what was wrong with the rules, because I assumed the rules were wrong, and I assumed that the implementation and things like that weren't that interesting. And then when I went to the local level, and as I started to talk with folks in government, in environmental law enforcement, when I started to talk with people in factories and people living next to factories, I gradually came to see that my view about how law actually gets to shape behavior and prevent this industrial pollution, and later also in other fields that I studied, I saw that much what I'd learned or not learned was actually either wrong or just a lot of things were missing. And then later when I moved to UCI and started to teach in the US and engage more and more with legal practitioners, but also with criminologists and psychologists, I saw there was an immense gap. There's an immense wealth of knowledge about the different mechanisms through which law shapes behavior. And somehow that knowledge, it doesn't really get out. It doesn't really reach people in the legal profession or even in law schools. I mean, some of it does, but not all of it. But even more important, I found this is not just about the experts or the professionals, it's also about the larger public. I saw that even if you have the knowledge and you're a prosecutor and you want to change things and be more based in the science, you're in a wider political sphere that's really shaped by the public discourse. And I saw there was a lot of intuition about how law does and doesn't work that just didn't shape up with the science. And that's why I approached Adam, and we took it from there. And Adam has his own story why he came to join me on this.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having us. It's really a pleasure to see you again and also to be here. So echoing Benjamin a little bit, my story doesn't necessarily start when I was in graduate school. Prior to graduate school, when I was an undergrad actually at Georgetown, I started working in a detention facility, tutoring adults experiencing detention there. And they would talk about the rules and how arbitrary they were and how unfair they were and how they didn't understand them. Well, that was interesting to think about, right? You have all these rules inside a facility where people don't understand them. They find them arbitrary. They find them unfair. How are you supposed to expect them then to obey those rules other than just being afraid of what happens when you do violate the rules? I graduated from Georgetown and to Teach for America. And while I was teaching, I started to see in the classroom, well, when I try to change kids' behavior by putting these rules on the wall, well, they're not really going to pay attention to the rules if they don't really trust me as a person. So I started to see how much the social norms and the groups around me were really impacting the culture of the classroom, were really impacting the way that these students were willing to obey the rules or break the rules. When I got to graduate school and I really started studying kids involved in the juvenile justice system, I started to see that, well, basically wherever we look, we all try to do exactly the same thing anytime we see misbehavior. We try to punish our way out of it, and punishment alone didn't seem to be working. So I was fortunate enough to be at UC Irvine back in the day when it was psychology and social behavior. Now it's psychological sciences, but a lot of our coursework was focused on understanding, well, how do you understand human behavior? How do you understand our social behavior? How do you understand what drives human behavior? And when I connected with Benjamin at UCI Law, Benjamin had the same types of questions and was approaching it from what he had been trained to do from the lawyer's perspective. And we realized, echoing what he said before, there's a huge mismatch between what lawyers think and what the law thinks drives human behavior and what psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, social workers on the other end believes actually drives human behavior.
What is really interesting here is if you look at the law school curricula, they're really not focusing that much on this. So that you may have a third-year optional course, maybe in criminology, maybe a course on law and society, but that's not really about the things our book is about. So we saw a lot of this wasn't being taught. So I've been teaching it in Irvine, small class. In Amsterdam, fortunately, I have a compulsory first-year law class with 1,000 students that do law and behavior. And it means that lawyers get taught largely to think in sort of ex post. Once there is wrong behavior or damaging behavior, we lawyers are able to find the rules and assess the liabilities, whether civil or administrative or criminal, and then we can find all the rules. But sort of shaping the behavior as it goes towards the future, of course, that's also part of the lawyer's job, but it's not really where we're trained for. And that's also, I think, a really important reason for me to really be engaged in this book.
Great. So now that you've talked about it a lot from the academic side, and, as someone who's a social psychologist who does psychology and law research, who, focused on behavioral economics in the law and did criminology as an undergrad, this book was made for me, but I'm not your only intended audience. So who else do you want to be, beyond Bridging the Gap, who else are you interested in getting this book, and who is it for?
I really remember at some point at UCI, we had a West Coast section of the Law and Society Association. We're all there in a big room, and somebody said at some point, well, we all know there's no proof for deterrence. And there's 100 people nodding, and I raised my hand and said, do you realize people out there don't know? And that was exactly why we wrote this book. Look, a lot was in the book. A lot of it, or parts of it, will be known to our colleagues. I mean, most colleagues don't go through everything that we covered in the book, but many things will be familiar. But to the larger audience, it isn't. And we saw that other popular books out there weren't really covering this. So we saw we needed to find a language, we tried, with examples to make it fun, to make it accessible, to reach that broader audience.
Yeah, adding on to that, whenever we face any form of misbehavior, and really it's from like the schoolyard up to the corporate boardroom, we try to punish our way out of it. We automatically think of punishment. We have what Benjamin and I call a punishment delusion. Right? This punitive intuition is deeply ingrained. And one of the things we do in the book is we trace it back through to cultural norms, to historical norms, as well as to religious roots too. You see it across many of the major religions during the current age. But if you take a look at the scientific evidence about punishment, it doesn't actually work the way that we think it does. And there are ways that punishment can become more effective, especially if it's paired alongside more science-based approaches, right? So it's not that we're arguing against punishment, it's that we're arguing that punishment is necessary, but it can be more effective if we think a little bit more critically about, for instance, how crimes take place. So one of the really fun things for me, and now talking to people now that this book has just come out, is that it's like the parents, it's the teachers, my friends who are still teaching children, right? Elementary through high school, as well as like the juvenile justice system administrators and justice system administrators who are really interested in this book. It's not just the lawyers and legal professionals, it's people sort of across the spectrum who are dealing with everyday misbehavior in their own lives.
Well, and also in that sense, I mean, we all care about the sort of safety problems that the book is about. Nobody wants to be a victim of violent crime. Nobody wants to be a victim of police abuse. Nobody wants to be a victim of sexual harassment at work. Nobody wants to be a victim of industrial pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really core things that the law is supposed to protect us from. And we just want folks to understand when it does and doesn't, and how the law can do so in a way that's much more effective at less cost. And that's sort of the selling thing for anybody in their own lives at work, but also in the voting booth and maybe at the coffee table talking about these issues. It's the issues that we're all facing, including COVID, which the book ends with.
Yes. So I mean, so to touch upon what you said, that there is this idea of, this delusion that punishment is going to deter. It's not only that it doesn't work, but it can also backfire in some respects. And what I found to be a particularly compelling example is, the daycare, putting a fine on daycares, right? Like they said if parents don't come on time, they're going to be fined. But then what happened was parents, realized, oh, I'm paying for their time. I don't have to feel guilty anymore that someone is staying past their time and, they're done with their day. They're being paid. So now I don't have to. Now, and more people ended up, keeping their kids there a little bit longer. We actually have that at my daycare too, but I'm knowing this, I want to be mindful. So, but right, like it backfires. But another example of, trying to implement something that seems so intuitive is the story, I don't know, Adam, if you want to take this on since it's in your home state of Arizona, about Arizona's petrified forest. So if you wanted to share that story.
Sure. Yeah, and let me add on to the daycare. So this was in Haifa.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things was, right, they were having a problem, parents were coming late, so they created this fine, as you mentioned, and the fine became a price, right? So you're paying now for the teacher to come late. And the really fascinating thing too is when they tried to actually change that, right? Tried to make parents come on time and now obey the rule that they had set. What did they do? Well, they got rid of the fine. And what did parents do? Continue to come late, right? Because they had already established a social norm that was really problematic. Parents were seeing other parents come late anyway. Now it's free, right? So it's intuitive if you think a little bit more deeply about the behavior and about the social norms. So the Arizona example is really fun. So Arizona has this petrified forest where there are these like 200 million year old radiant pieces of petrified wood that have been fossilized over time. And they were having big issues with theft. People were going to the park, they were stealing the pieces of wood, and they were going along their merry way. So they tried a variety of different things to try to decrease the theft behavior. One of the most fun ones were these conscience piles. And so what they basically did is they had these repentant thieves drop off the pieces of wood on their way out of the park. And that kind of makes sense, right? They're trying to tell people who are leaving the park, hey, don't do it, right? In fact, drop it here. But what they ended up doing was allowed those wood piles to actually reach the size of like a pickup truck. So what does that do for you? you're leaving the park with a piece of wood and you see that there's all this wood that left at the park entrance or exit, and there's a lot of the wood that's left there, that probably means a lot of people do repent, but probably a lot of people are still continuing to steal the wood. Benjamin, do you want to explain the sign part of this example so I don't hog all of the time here?
No, that's fine. So what they also did, I mean, there was also a sign threatening people if they were stealing that they were going to get caught. And they did an experiment. They tried a sign with 3 people, 3 thieves, and then the same message: if you steal, you will get caught and punished, and versus a sign with 1 thief and the same message. And then they compared how much wood was being stolen. If you want to get the details on how they did that exactly, they're in the book. It's fun. Because any of these studies, by the way, there's always a backstory to how they did it. It's never easy. And they found there was a significant large difference that simply seeing more people on the sign makes people more likely to steal. So what is really the big takeaway here in the book in general? So this shows that if you punish, you may be undermining an existing social norm. So you might have a negative effect there. Or you might be creating a negative social norm. You might be showing, if you're saying, oh, for instance, we caught all these drug runners and now you're showing all the guns and the drugs, you may have 2 messages. One is, we're going to catch you, which is a deterrent, so that's positive. But at the same time, you may be showing that this actually is happening and it's normal. And that's a negative message. And if you read the whole book, you'll find that in total, for any sort of punishment, 18 different things can happen, 1/8. And 8 of these are positive. So that in that sense, punishment may make people more compliant. 10 are negative. And it depends really on the situation, on the type of crime, the type of perpetrator, the type of punishment, how it's executed, how it's communicated, which of these you're going to activate. And that's sort of part of our big message is, look, if you're going to get a punishment in the mix, be smart about it, understand how it latches on. It's not just about deterrence. It is about so much more. And that's what part of the story in the book is about.
So, I mean, when you talk about deterrent, it's sort of you're taking this external motivation in order to try to get people to comply. But really, as you're showing, that there might be other factors that might be playing that you're not really touching upon their either personal motivations or their perceptions of what's going on. You know, it's there's a disconnect, and with that disconnect, it's incredibly ineffective. But what about, you know, positive incentives of rewards, and what would you say about that? You know, in general, you might think, you know, positivity might, you know, engage people more. And what do you say about that?
So we have a full chapter on these positive extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. So for instance, take California right now. California is trying to create a $60 million, I believe is the number, a pilot project where they would reward people who are actually staying off of meth and cocaine and other types of substances. And they're following in the footsteps of the US Department of Veterans Affairs that has been doing this for years with veterans who have substance abuse issues, right? So they actually reward you for taking steps towards your recovery. And there's a long line of studies that actually show that these sorts of extrinsic rewards can help you along a path towards recovery, can help you lead either a more sober life or a completely sober life, right? And to stay off of substances for longer. These sorts, they call them contingency management types of programs. And these types of programs can be really effective, but they can also backfire. The problem is, and it's sort of the same thing with children. For those of you who are in the audience who might actually have children, your children might go to schools where they get a sticker or they move up a tier anytime they do something right, and then they move back, right? And if they remove the sticker or they lose a step anytime they do something wrong in schools. And I'm sure there's several of you who've experienced that.
We actually have a question here saying, can we apply these principles to parenting? So
sure. Sure. Yeah. So
whole book.
Yeah, you absolutely can. And I'll try to make that a little bit more clear here too, right? So these types of things it's a fantastic idea, right? Where you are using these extrinsic rewards to try to motivate the right behavior. And they're really cheap many of the times. I mean, what's like the cost of 500 stickers? It's pretty cheap, I imagine. It's been a minute since I've bought stickers, but I think they're pretty cheap. So this sort of thing, if you set it up, it's a really good idea. The problem is that they can also backfire. if this extrinsic reward becomes the only motivation. If I'm only behaving well or doing the right behavior because I want that reward, not because of the behavior itself, not because of where that behavior leads me. So these extrinsic reward systems, especially with parenting, can be really effective for promoting positive behavior, but you have to do them in a way that links them directly to the exact behavior and why you want them to behave a certain way. And that's the core idea there. Extrinsic rewards are great only if and to the extent that they're linked to the behavior and the person whose behavior you're trying to change gets that, understands that, and is on the same page with you. And I know Benjamin's experienced this as a parent of 2 children who will probably watch this recording, so you have to be careful with what you say here, but it's a very real thing for parents.
I mean, the interesting thing for me here was, as we were writing about this, I mean, my kids are a bit bigger now. My son is 6'3" by now. As they were smaller, I would reward them with a sticker before they went to bed. And at some point, they had a lot of stickers on their face, but at some point, they wouldn't go to bed. And that's the interesting thing. A positive incentive can easily become a negative incentive, a punishment, if you're not giving it anymore. But the bigger story here, and this is another bigger story in the book, is, look, if you're going to use extrinsic motivations, try and build them towards intrinsic motivation. So if you stay at the extrinsic, you keep on having to do that. What you want is that at some point it latches on deeper. And a good example that we start the book with is seatbelts. So if you look at the 70s, in the 70s, US Congress adopted a law, a national law mandating that every car had a seatbelt. So from that moment on, every car had a seatbelt, but people weren't using it. So then they adopted a law, and states started to adopt laws mandating that people actually click their seatbelt. And we see that as states adopted this, simply adopting a law led to an increase in seatbelt usage by about 50%. So that's great. Just having the rule works. Then they had these click it or ticket campaigns. There was law enforcement, very low fines, by the way, only $100 US, went up a bit more. Then we got these persuasive messages, the crash test dummies. You saw what happens if you don't click in. And finally, we saw that car manufacturers started to install these warning beeps. And all of that together, if you think about it now, whereas in the early 1980s, very few people clicked their seatbelts. Right now, you don't even make a decision anymore. It's become completely automated. So it's gone from extrinsic fully to not just intrinsic, but to automated. We don't even think about it differently. And that to me is a really interesting success story that we in the book also contrast with what happened at speeding. Speeding has much higher fines, yet somehow speeding, we've never been able to do this. And these are the interesting sort of examples where we can all think in our lives, okay, what are the lessons here? What can we learn? And one of these lessons, as I said earlier, think about how do you go to intrinsic and then to automatic behavior. And you can't do that for all behavior, but it's always this sort of direction you want to move rather than stay in the sort of punishment reward modus. Because if you stay there, well, it's going to cost you more than stickers.
Yeah. So to try there, so what should we do? You're not saying we should get rid of punishment. You're not saying that, positive incentives are all bad, but there are other ways to do this. So, and there are multiple ways that you do it, that we can even fix certain things without even getting to motivation at all. You talk about the situational aspect of crime. So why don't you share what this sort of approach would be?
I think this is really the forgotten story to a large extent. So we called our book earlier the invisible code because a lot of this is invisible. So the punishment is very visible. Some of the incentives are very visible, at least to lawyers, but a lot of the other stuff is less visible. And we really found that powerful drivers here are situational things. And there's 2 aspects. I'll discuss the first one. I'll leave the second one to Adam. So when we did, since April 2020, Adam and I have studied social distancing behavior. So we did a study in 5 countries, and we've continued to study this in the Netherlands since April 2020 till today. So we have a longitudinal data set where we actually see this. And one of the things we consistently find in all these countries, the biggest variable that explains whether people follow advisory or mandatory social distancing rules is whether they're able to keep a distance, whether they can keep away from crowds, whether they can work at home, et cetera, et cetera. That's the most important variable. So in other words, we see that there's a strong influence on people's ability to follow rules. And here is one of the big takeaways in the book. Most people don't know most rules. So we have way too much law. So according to an estimate from the late 1990s, by the late 1990s, US companies were bound by about 300,000 rules backed up by criminal sanctions. How can anybody, so imagine you're a CEO of a company. Let's say you have 30 lawyers. Then each of these lawyers has to memorize 10,000 rules and has to be able to tell you these on a daily basis. So that system works ex post. Once you do something wrong, we find lawyers, they find out what you did, they apply the rules. But from an ex ante point of view, where we are, in order to change behavior, it's really hard. So that's one, it's the capacity to obey rules because you don't, whether you know them. Second one is self-control, big theory in criminology. Third one is socioeconomic conditions. And here's a very sad fact that because of our criminal justice system and the way it punishes, it actually reduces the opportunities to education, to employment and housing that actually they need in order to lead a law-abiding life. So the figures are very clear. For every extra year of school, you prevent a lot of violent crime. So that's the sort of capacity in a nutshell. But there's a second part to this situational approach.
Sure. And so just taking one step back, we lay out 6 different steps that people should take in order to address any sort of misbehavior. These are the steps that you should go through. This is what you should be looking at. And what we're talking about here is one of them, right? This is really just one of the 6. And we call this, we're basing this in the literature on situational crime prevention. And so rather than punish the crime after the fact, figuring out what is the right ratio of costs and benefits and incentives and fines and fees that you need in order to deter people, instead we think about what do you actually need in order for you to engage in the particular crime, right? So for instance, we'll take you to Germany, we'll take you to the Netherlands, and we'll talk about motorcycle theft. Well, they figured out a way to dramatically reduce, to dramatically reduce motorcycle theft. And it was by actually requiring that anytime you wear a motorcycle or you're on a motorcycle, you wear a helmet. So what that actually meant is that anytime someone was trying to steal a motorcycle, they'd have to walk around the streets with a motorcycle helmet on their arm, because then they wouldn't stand out once they stole a motorcycle. And there's other examples as well of where you're actually using how the crime takes place to reduce the actual crime in the future. One of the ones that we think is the most fun is the public urination ones, right? So different cities across the world have tried different approaches to reduce public urination. Many cities have tried just ramping up the fine. Okay, well, $500 didn't work. What about 1,000? 1,000 didn't work. What about 50? Right? You try this approach of just making the punishment more severe, but it turns out that people aren't weighing the costs and benefits of public urination before they actually do that when they're, after a late night out. So instead, what some districts have done is they've done things like using paint that actually repels liquids back at the direction from which it came. Or they use these light systems that actually shine a light very brightly whenever they detect motion. And these types of things are highly effective at actually reducing these types of misbehaviors and crimes, right? That we don't actually want in our cities. So what this shows is a very new and very different way of dealing with misbehavior that doesn't rely just on ramping up the punishment. Instead, we focus on how the misbehavior actually happens, and we make it either harder or impossible to do so. In our book, we go through different examples from public urination to the helmets for motorcycles, as well as for terrorists as well, which is why now we go through such an intense screening process, or maybe not intense, but annoying screening process anytime we board an airplane. It comes from that situational crime prevention approach of actually averting some massive attempts at terrorist attacks.
Yeah, it's essentially looking at how people commit crimes as opposed to why people commit crimes, which can be a much easier way to deal with it and also can be way more effective.
Well, we also look at why it's not used more. So one example that we discuss is that for distracted driving, a lot of jurisdictions are now installing all kinds of cameras. And in the Netherlands, we were very proud. Our police was very proud because they were renting these really big touring cars, these big buses. And the police from a high vantage point looking down whether people were using the phone. And as I was hearing all this, I was reading about 2 things. One is that every iPhone already has the ability to know that you're in your car. So if you use Spotify in your car, it'll say that it's in car modus. And actually, Apple has filed a patent earlier to actually say, yes, this can be used to against distracted driving. And the parents of somebody killed by his distracted driver sued Apple. Why didn't it actually switch this on? So there's a reason, if you think about this, why don't we use this more? It is because of freedom. So when we go back to the seatbelt example, there was a big outrage in the 70s because the law didn't just mandate that every car had a seatbelt. The Highway Authority also was going to adopt a rule that that there was going to be a sort of ignition lock, that if you didn't click in, you couldn't start your car, and people were so angry about this. This really shows the sort of backlash you can get, and we discussed this in our book in light also of the gun debates in the US, which obviously are very sensitive and very complex. But guns is, for us at least, a prime example of for certain violent crimes, what do you need? How do you do it? Well, a gun would be easy, would be much better. Maybe take away the gun. And if you look at that, that is a strong argument to regulate guns. But we did look at the counter argument, which is freedom. And I think that's where you have to balance. So that's another thing about the book. We try and show the nuance. We're not selling one approach. Every approach has downsides. It's all about combinations and knowing about the different options.
Absolutely. You took my next part about how you're nuanced, but it's great. I love it. So you guys touched upon two different aspects. Adam, I'm going to go to yours first. So what I also really love that you did in the book is part of this is the nuance that you tackle on, someone might say, okay, maybe long incarceration doesn't deter, but I'm taking them away from the situation, right? You're saying I'm completely removing them from being able to do crime. And so maybe it's an extreme version of that, but I'm doing that. And yet we're still not really seeing this reduction in crime. So I love that you sort of, are thinking about what someone might respond and addressing it with the empirical research for it. So what would you say what does the research say on that kind of argument?
Sure, yeah. So what you're referring to is the incapacitation effect, right? It's this idea where we're just going to lock away the bad guys and that will keep the rest of us good guys safe, right? Out on the streets. The unfortunate reality is that the evidence is very mixed and leans more towards incapacitation actually has very little effect, right? So oftentimes when you actually remove someone from the street, it's not as though they're not going to commit any crimes. Well, they just start to commit those different types of offenses once they're in a facility, and people actually take their place on the street as well, right? Depending on the types of crimes that they were actually engaged in. Beyond that, there's also these diminishing returns of incarceration. Calculating the effect of incarceration on people's recidivism risk or the reoffending rates is remarkably difficult, but we do try to walk folks through the literature that has tried to do so. Over time, within person, between states, between counties, right? We've tried to walk everyone through that literature. And what it boils down to is the evidence is remarkably mixed, but it does seem to have diminishing returns. There might be an impact in the first year or 2 years or 3 years, especially during like the late adolescent years, when we are the most impulsive, we are the most reckless, and we are least concerned about our future. But after that, there's pretty much no evidence that longer prison sentences will actually do very much to keep society safer. In fact, it might actually make society less safe because the longer that you're inside an institution, the more you become institutionalized and the less able you are to actually live a law-abiding life afterwards. You're not trained inside an institution to lead a law-abiding life afterwards. When you've been out of the workforce for so long, what skills have you actually been able to learn? And it's not the people who are experiencing incarceration's fault, it's incarceration's fault. We don't provide the services that they actually need in order to lead a law-abiding life afterwards. And as Benjamin mentioned earlier, there's this issue of the box. A lot of us have heard of this attempt to ban the box, right? So that people who are applying for jobs don't have to mark that they do have a felony conviction on their record. But there's this notion of not only being boxed out, but also being boxed in. The fact that we require this of people who have experienced incarceration, who have been branded as a felon, does remove their ability to lead a law-abiding life because it becomes significantly harder for them to get a job. And then we make getting a job a part of your requirements to stay out of prison moving forward too. So what this all boils down to is it's pretty complex. We're not doing a great job with this. And the idea that throwing people into prison will actually cure them and keep society safe is pretty far-fetched. Benjamin and I refer to prison in our book as sort of public storage because that's kind of what it really is.
And then back to, so we've been, touching upon social norms as we go through this at play. And I thought about it myself. I grew up in New York City, and, jaywalking is just part of life, and, standing in the street so that you can jaywalk as quickly as soon as that opportunity arises, you do it. And then coming here in California, people don't stand in the street waiting to cross the street. And, that was something I realized I did that was kind of strange. And also to kind of say, people who think that they might be, rule followers, like maybe you're just a basically rule follower and you don't even realize. But what sort of I thought about, and there are two aspects to this, is this sort of enforcement discretion, right? Because nobody is enforcing that in New York City at all. So the societal norms and the morals at play are maybe affected by the enforcement discretion, but also the flip side of the enforcement discretion could affect maybe the perceived legitimacy of the system itself. And was curious to know how does that play a role in terms of compliance and non-compliance?
So if you look at law enforcement, one of its core functions is to end impunity, and it is to set a norm. So if you're not enforcing a rule at all, you're giving a signal that the rule doesn't even exist. I mean, people might not even know it if you're not enforcing it. So that's a very important element that there's not a lot of literature on this, which is interesting. It's sort of a known fact that if you have impunity, you have a problem. So I think that's part of this. But there's another part here as well. We also discussed one study, which we do right after talking about the New York subways and manspreading posters. There's a couple of studies in the Netherlands where they look at if you focus on law enforcement and you focus on signs saying you shouldn't violate something in a situation where people are all violating, you actually make the behavior worse. And this is a very deep insight, even though it comes only from 2 studies. And talking about nuance, I'm increasingly uncomfortable talking about big lessons from singular or just 2 cool studies. So bear with me here. We need a broader body of work. But the interesting insight is if you introduce a rule in a context where you know that rule will often be broken, where you can't really enforce it, or where you won't enforce it, or will you enforce it only a little bit, you're going to undermine the legitimacy not only of that rule, but of rules in general. So this study, which was published in Science, also shows a sort of experimental version of a broken windows effect. So they show that if there's, for instance, graffiti in a place where graffiti is not allowed with a sign, people are also more likely to break other types of rules. So that's a really big problem, because we end up doing all of us doing that also in our normal lives, even with kids. I keep telling my kids every day, you shouldn't be doing this. They are doing that every day. So what am I doing? Am I enforcing a rule, or am I just undermining my own authority? And that's the hard thing, because obviously you want to enforce the rule, but somehow if you can't do that, if you end up not doing that. So I think marijuana is another example where at some point maybe you have to say, well, maybe the social norm isn't so bad after all. The same with jaywalking in New York. So it depends, I guess, also on what the damage is, whether you should have, I mean, sort of limit that discretion and then go for tough law enforcement. And again, going back to everything we said, it also depends on how the enforcement interacts with some of the other processes.
Yeah, and adding on to that, we talk quite a bit about the notion of legitimacy and the felt obligation to obey the law. When you think about why people obey the law, a large part of why we just obey the law is because it's the law. It simply is the law, and you obey the law, right? We have this voluntary deference to the law, not out of fear or compulsion that we're afraid of what happens, but because, well, that's what we do, right? We're part of this law-abiding society. We believe that people should obey the law. We respect the law to some degree, and so we therefore obey the law. But that legitimacy, while it is a really strong driver of people's compliance behavior, it's also a really strong predictor of why people do not comply with the law. When you don't respect the authority, when you believe that the authority is unjust, that it's biased, that it treats people like you unfairly, you are very much more likely to actually disobey the law and the law's enforcers. So when it comes to actually wanting to when you're creating a rule in a place where people don't actually respect either the enforcers or the law itself or the body that's creating the law, well, you should question that for a second, right? And Benjamin mentioned earlier the New York Metro, right? So on the New York subway, they tried to actually reduce manspreading, and people were are still go onto the subway cars, and they do routines, and then they ask for money, right? Like things that are pretty normal on the subway. And they tried to ban all of these different types of things with signs that you shouldn't do it. And why would people actually obey that? Well, they just thought that people obey it because it's the new rule, but I have no reason to obey you, especially when there are so many different broken down things that are happening on the subway, when you're never on time, when I can't trust you to actually do your job. Why would I actually obey you, especially when this is how I make money, or if it's frankly more comfortable, right, to spread your legs across multiple seats and maybe lie down. So what we talk about in the book, and we use these different examples, we also use a large body of research, largely by Tom Tyler, or started by Tom Tyler and folks like him, on this notion of legitimacy and this notion of how much do you actually trust the authority creating or enforcing these laws, rules, and regulations.
The good news there is that there is a win-win situation where you can have better policing, because then there's going to be more trust and less crime. And that's really, I think, a very strong message today in sort of where the media tries to contrast this. Any police reform will lead to more crime. Well, actually, if police are acting in ways that undermine people's trust, that is going to increase crime. So reforming that is a really big message. That isn't just our message. I mean, this message has been out there. We're trying to bring it to a broader audience.
Yeah, and I hope that there was a question in the chat that sort of talked about, what the people of authority might be the ones who are acting inappropriately, and how does that play a role. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, I mean, I can say another thing in the book about that. That's in the corporate section. So the book is also about corporate misconduct and violations and transgressions. And there you do see that sort of what research called tone at the top. What people at the top say matters. That's been said a lot, and the values they express. But we also look at what is sort of organizational culture. Everybody can think about their workplace and sort of see what is good in the culture at my workplace. What is good about the values we share, but what might be bad? And we sort of show the worst of the worst. We show 3 cases. And there you see what is really bad is if, and this is kind of counterintuitive, if the leaders are portraying this really positive message about ethics, but not making it possible for the employees to actually act ethical, for instance, because they have targets that are not reasonable, or because they don't get the time to actually meet these targets, or they can't speak out, that will be double undermining of trust in these authorities and also of the rules. So that's another takeaway, a little bit different from the others that are so focused on sort of criminal justice.
So I have a few more questions, but I also would like to open it up to the audience. And we have one question in the chat, kind of a strange question for me, but so much of the law is poorly defined and concerns multiple decision makers, use of police discretion, for instance, involve policy and cultural factors that aren't really written down anywhere, and is affected by the interaction between the police and civilian involved in the situation. Do you believe that defining these rules more clearly would help, or studying these scenarios would help more, or both, or neither? So it's a little bit of what we've touched upon, but a little bit of a different angle.
I think the hard thing is we already have so many rules. So I think, and as a lawyer, I would say, yes, we need to define all the rules better. I don't think we can get out of sort of our customs, our social norms, and other rules. I think for when we're really talking about police, obviously, you need to, I mean, when you have, we're talking about people who have a duty and a right to also exercise violence sometimes, or exercise the state monopoly on violence, they need to be restricted by many rules. I think if it's about certain types of interactions, it will really depend on which ones, I would say. So you really have to look at the case. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of saying we need more laws, rules, and regulations, because I agree with Benjamin, we have many, and one of the core issues that we talk about in the book is people oftentimes are just unaware of what the law or the rule or the regulation actually is, right? That there's a core issue there. But I do think that if there is a setting where, right, that she's describing, you do need to clearly define that rule or that law, but you also need to ensure that the people that it's going to impact fully understand what that rule and that law actually are. It doesn't do anything to create a new law if people don't understand what it is and what it's expecting of them. So I would say yes, in that sort of setting you do. But one of the things that we try to do is give people the tools, right? I mentioned earlier the 6 steps that you could use to determine what you need to do moving forward to reduce the misbehavior. And once you do this deeper analysis at these different levels of what's actually happening, what's creating the misbehavior, what are the social norms, what are the current rules and regulations, why are people not following them, why are people following them, that will sort of illuminate, I think, the path forward to what you should be doing within that particular context.
I just see a very important question also in the chat from Karen, which is about what if the rules themselves are wrong and amoral and racist. And that's a really, really major issue. So first of all, in our book, we talk about civil disobedience. So we actually say, look, if rules are immoral, actually, there's sort of a duty not to obey them. We also have a whole chapter on morality and sort of look, if rules don't match up with people's own morality, they're less likely to obey them. But for me, why I pick out this question is our book can be read as a sort of guidebook how to make people more compliant. And unless you have a legal system that in of itself has just rules, it can really be a book that helps unjust rules to be more effective. And that's really sort of what our book is not about. I mean, our book isn't about what are just rules or not. There are many books about that, but we do highlight that, look, don't just see our book as the last normative issue on law. The first question you have to ask is, what is a good law? The second is, how are you going to make it work? Our book is not about the first, it's about the second. But I think if you don't do the second, the first question won't really work well. And that's why I really pick out this question, because we are very much in line with criticizing rules that are unjust, and they should be criticized.
Yeah, I think you also, what you do really well in the book is that it's not always about what the law is, but how it's perceived and how it's understood. And so, you know, it's important to, there's research to show that people don't necessarily, not that they don't necessarily know the law, but they don't assume what the correct law would be in particular scenarios, or even if it is on the books, that they don't necessarily understand it the way that it is intended. And that is going to affect how it's, whether they're, you know, they abide by it or not, because it all depends on the perception of it as well. So
Yes.
As you talk about with the first and second, I think that is, you know, very important.
And one of the things that we talk about too is that people, right? So we give a ton of different examples when it comes to, you know, the constitutional. People don't know anything about, you know, there's something in there about not quartering troops in your house, right, during peacetime. Things right there, they're built right. I know. And then beyond that, we also talk about lawyers or doctors not understanding laws when it comes to healthcare. We talk about people who are renting houses or apartments not understanding what protections they actually have against unfair landlords. So it's a core issue that virtually all of us face, and virtually all of us don't know that we're facing.
Exactly.
Oftentimes what happens is we conflate what we think is moral, right, or just with what the law actually is. We think we know what the law is because we intuitively believe something, and then we just say, well, that's what the law has to be. And in most cases, we're actually incredibly wrong. Some of the work that my colleagues do is we actually look at how much are justice-involved youth and their families knowledgeable about the laws that are impacting them. And these are people youth who've already been caught for different types of crimes, are already in the system, they're on probation, so they've gone through it, and they're fundamentally misunderstanding what the role of a prosecutor or a public defender actually is, right? They don't know the rules that they're supposed to be following. Most of the time, they don't actually understand all of the rules of their probation and what happens to them if they violate probation. And these are people who are already in the system.
Right.
So I think there's this huge issue where we believe that people understand the laws, rules that are supposed to be applying to them, and they don't necessarily do that.
Your moral coherence ideas also is with the policymakers and the lawmakers themselves, right? They also they might be pushing something because they believe in that, and then they believe that it's more effective. So the ones that are creating these policies are the ones who, you know, they have their gut feelings too, right? They're not, you know, separate from, you know, the rest of us, and that also could be pushing ineffective policies.
I'm doing a whole research project about what I call behavior intuition right now. This is the ERC project, European Research Council project. And it's based on this idea that we're all humans and we all know about behavior. We all behave, we all parent, we're all parented. We are in job roles. And yet very few of us have studied behavioral science. So I wanted to understand what are our gut instincts about behavioral influence and how do they compare with the science? And we do that both in the general population, but also with prosecutors, with regulators, and with in-house counsel, and in China also with the police. And it's quite interesting when we're developing this research is how far away sometimes the ideas are. I mean, I see that also when I teach from our book, which I've been doing for a couple of years. Students, even if they read all these studies, they sort of say, well, this is Mr. Van Rooij's and Mr. Fine's opinion. When I then say, well, no, it's based on systematic reviews. We show the exceptions to sort of the mainstream findings. We show where we're unsure, etc. And they still don't buy it. And then I go back to what is also in the book, like, look, this makes me think of President Nixon, who at some point in the 70s said, some social theorists claim that capital punishment doesn't have a deterrent effect. I'm convinced it does. And in a way, as we say in the book, we're all Nixon. I mean, depending on the type of crime, we all have a favorite perpetrator where we do morally think there should be stronger punishment. And probably because of that, we also think that the punishment will work. We've seen that ourselves when we were reading different studies. I find my brain is more critical, let's say, of studies where, let's say, I'm personally not in favor morally of capital punishment. So any study that says capital punishment doesn't work, I'm like, yay. I mean, I'm not doing that consciously, but my brain takes it easy. And then the studies that say it works, my brain says that can't be true. So I read it critically. And as I was observing myself, I was seeing, wow, there's Nixon in me. And that is a big warning to just showing people the science is not going to be enough. We have to talk about what makes us resist the science in order for us to open up to it. Even if the findings, which they often are uncomfortable or we don't like them.
Absolutely. It's similar, like if you go to a doctor and you don't hear what you like, you're more inclined to get a second opinion, as opposed to, you know, if you hear something that, oh, you're doing well, you're not likely to go and get a second opinion to question that. So there are things happening in the chat. So just
I love that example, by the way, because that's exactly what you can do with science. Yeah. And that's what we see the courts do. So in one of the studies, we're looking at how the courts have been using the science and applying the Eighth Amendment. And there is a test. They have to show that there is actually a punitive goal. And part of the test is that the rationale should be deterrent. And there is always a body of work where you can find that it is deterrent. So the courts need to have a systematic way to review the evidence like the scientists do. So they actually weigh it. And they haven't been doing that up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So Dana says, we are encountering this in my city. We have progressive prosecutors, I'm reading it out loud for the recording, who believes in turning over Brady evidence. Problem is, his line prosecutors interpret Brady differently. They default to protecting the police officers whose conduct might give rise to a judge finding them to be untrustworthy. So the prosecutors say, just wanted to let you know there's a Brady evidence on this officer, but then fails to disclose the actual evidence. Yeah, I mean, that's, it's a big deal. I think there's research to say that, when judges do decide that there was a Brady violation, they're less inclined to name the officer or prosecutor when doing so to, to protect them as well. So, yeah,
I think, I mean, to look at sort of Brady violations from our book's perspective, and we don't talk about them in detail, we have to flip the question. So, of course, the core question is, what does it mean for the defendant in that case? And that's the core question that has to be answered. But we would argue, also look at how do we prevent this from happening in the future, both with this prosecutor or this police department, if they're involved, as well as with others. And that is not always the same question. It doesn't always have the same answer. So I think, you can use the same questions in our book sort of to see this. And there's a lot of different types of Brady violations. Some are incompetence. Some are more willing. So with one, you may want to look at the motivations. With others, you want to work on the capacity. Maybe you want to see whether there's opportunity waste. Maybe you can make it harder to have Brady violations. So I think somebody who knows more about Brady and sort of evidence collection and sharing than the two of us can apply some of the insights in our book on this designing policy, how to reduce it.
There's also a larger issue there too, right? Of what message does misinterpreting or interpreting Brady differently actually send to the general public? And that to me goes back to legitimacy. Yep. So when you undermine legitimacy of the justice system, you're actually creating more crime. And when you're showing officers that you're going to protect bad officers or officers who've made a number of mistakes and so on, right? You are actually sending a message to the broader police force about your stance too, right? So I think that the broader issue here is of legitimacy, and we know legitimacy is one of the main drivers of behavior from an internal point of view.
And to add just one final thing on this also reminds me of the big issue of culture. So if you want to reform prosecutors, departments, or police, you're also dealing with a certain culture, as we've seen in corporate America. And one of the hardest things that I see in corporations is that once there's scandals, at some point, all these privacy concerns kick in. So, and then suddenly there's a big blanket over everything. Everything is lawyered up and nobody can learn actually from what happened. I think so there's a downside to our sort of protection of privacy in scandals. And I do think we need to, at points, balance that with the need to learn from mistakes and also that others can learn from mistakes. So I think this also may apply to sort of the most egregious Brady violations, such as we've seen in Orange County.
So there's one question, then maybe I will end with one as well, but how concerned are you about the validity of the underlying research given the replicability fraud issues that plague the fields of social psychology? For example, the replicability concerns with the 2000 Israeli daycare study. So you do talk about that in the book so why don't you take it away? Yeah,
so that is a major concern. So that's one of the reasons, first of all, we talk in specific about this study that there's now a lot of concerns about the signing at the top and then signing at the bottom. We first let the reader read the study as is. And then we go a bit further, and at some point we say, well, they did a second study published again in this top journal, where they then said, well, we replicated and we don't find the same things. And then we say, look, for these types of studies, which we say are sort of at the front line of knowledge, they have experimental designs that may be difficult to replicate or that may have certain effects that we're not sure of. We have to realize if these are singular studies and not massive bodies of work with replication, with randomized controlled trials, et cetera, we have to be very careful. So if I compare that body of work to, let's say, the body of work on the effects of treatment, on for instance, a cognitive treatment, on a criminal reoffending, that body of work is massive. There's meta-analyses, they're all randomized controlled trials, there's no external validity problems because they're actual treatments to actual people. If I compare that with some of the really cool studies, it's very different. And when we were researching this and writing this, at some point I said to Adam, I've sort of a rule of thumb here. The cooler the title of the study, the higher it's placed in a journal, so science, the more attention it's had in the media, the less I think it will be replicated and the less I will believe it. And that's the problem. And that's, I think, also the problem of some of the other pop psych books that are similar to ours. They're sort of cherry picking on the coolest examples and saying, oh, all of this will work. I don't believe that. I think all of this is hard. There's no easy takeaways. And all we try to do is bring the nuance of the sorts of things that may be at play and to inform people how they can combine them. But don't be fooled by just a few really cool studies. And the daycare center study is indeed one where there have been concerns. We realize that.
I love this question. So I'm a psychologist by training, and I now am in a criminology criminal justice department. And the replication fraud crises that have plagued social psychology, that are rampant issues, right? And that social psychology is doing a really good job of trying to rectify moving forward, has not necessarily hit other fields quite yet. And when it has hit other fields, it hasn't been as public necessarily. It's not as big as social psychology. So these are issues in every area of science, right? So what we try to do in this book is maintain the nuance. We try to show you, based off of our current read of the current literature, here are our takeaways. Here's what we think are the most important messages. And we never try to rely on just one single study, because there are going to be problems with studies. We know that moving forward, things are not going to replicate every single time or within different types of contexts. So we try to maintain that nuance and to explain what we think is the amount of generalizability from the studies that we do review, and what are the big takeaways across an entire body of literature. So I absolutely love that question. And that is an issue for so many different fields. And one thing I'm really looking forward to is seeing how it's going to impact other fields that have not necessarily caught up quite yet to the different types of methodologies that social psychologists have started to implement.
I think also, oh, sorry. No.
One advantage that we have is we don't have a stake in these studies mostly. No. So we didn't write a book about our own work. We actually left most of our own work out. And that gives us sort of a distance. We don't have a stake in most of these debates. We're not in particular schools of study or theories, or, I mean, that's also why we were able to just say, okay, let's look at a larger group. Yeah, and you can always find things that we didn't do, which people have pointed out. But it makes it easier for us to also just say, okay, well, maybe we know this, maybe we don't.
What I also love is at the end, you talk about how, journals should be more inclined to publish null results, and so that we're not, trying to conduct research, that people will know that maybe this isn't something that is replicable or an effect in and of itself. And so, that will also, I'm very grateful that you put that in there to show that, these are really interesting studies that we've brought in, but we need to have more of the other kinds of studies out there to help us inform what we're trying to do. So I did have a question about what you would like to do, what you hope your readers will get out of this. But I also know that we are a few minutes over. So if people need to leave, I understand, and thank you. What I would like to say is, I love that you've created this code to be able to think about problems. I think there are a lot of articles out there that talk about a really big problem. It's sound, and they're good problems, but then they have like a few paragraphs at the end. And so we need to fix it. And we have this broad idea of how to fix it. And I feel that your book gives the rubric, or gives the behavioral code to kind of think through that grand idea of how to fix this, legitimate problem that someone has come through. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So people need to go. I sort of wanted to end it, but I do have this question of, what do you hope that you get from your readers? If I could hold you guys on for a few more minutes.
Sure. Thank you. Great. For those who are leaving, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure. Benjamin, do you want to give that one a go, and then I'll finish it out?
I would hope several things. So first of all, I hope that a broad audience starts to see how law is a major force also for good in their lives. So often we hear about the negative sides of law because we see court cases or we see injustice, but law can actually do good things. And also I hope that they start to be better informed in all the choices that they make in their lives and how they can make that system work better. That's sort of my core goal, so that we get a different public discourse that is not just about the easy fix or the gut response, but rather about a more nuanced and comprehensive response. That's for me the reason I wrote this book.
My biggest reason is to move us beyond just punishment alone. I think that for too long we've used punishment as our answer to everything. Anytime there's misbehavior, as we mentioned earlier, from your kids up to executives or to people committing crime in the street, right, we move to punishment. And if punishment isn't working, we just make the punishment tougher and harder and hope that that's going to work. Right now, we're experiencing as a nation higher than normal violent crime rates and crime rates in general. And we are going to see politicians from both sides of the aisle calling for tougher punishment and more punishment. It's going to happen, and it's already happening in certain spheres. But while we say that punishment is, of course, necessary, right? We can't let people get away with crime regardless of the type of crime, and we do need to hold people accountable, and it's necessary to some extent for retribution too, depending on how you define it. It's not enough for changing behavior. So what we want to do is to lay out this behavioral code, give people the tools that they can use to actually ensure that our laws and our rules work, that they keep us safe, and that they can actually reduce the misbehavior that we don't want.
Thank you. Well, I really hope that policymakers get a hold of this book so they can understand how to, to have this rubric of what to think about and to make, us safer and our lives better, and to really reduce the criminal behavior, small to large. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And thank you all for coming. This was a real treat for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for hosting us. This was a real treat for me too. Wonderful.